Uh, the mission statement of the Advanced Initiative is basically that we want to see a movement of gospel-centered, multi-ethnic churches planted by or among Indian Americans, right? And we always say, we actually mean every single word of that mission statement. We mean everything that's included in that mission statement. And even in this breakout, we're specifically looking at the word multi-ethnicity, right? And I think it's appropriate that we call this breakout gospel and multi-ethnicity, because we really want to say, and even Mo hinted at this earlier when he spoke, the conversation of multi-ethnicity is not founded by the Advanced Initiative. It's not founded by Western Christianity. It is at the very heart of Jesus Christ. The triune God himself has written this, and he values it. It's core to who he is and how he has created us to be. And so we're really grateful that the starting point for this conversation is not us or this country or any of that. It's God himself. And so we really want to consider that. And so this morning, what we wanted to do is essentially two things. One is we want to be able to lay out just a biblical framework for what we mean by multi-ethnicity. We want to start at the Bible to kind of figure out, okay, what do we mean by that? Where is the scripture helping us to see that sort of thing? And then to move from there, we want to talk through just a practical application of it. How does this translate into life and to how we do ministry? And so how we want to do that is Dr. Yukon is going to be up here in a little bit, and he's going to share from God's word, and he's going to help set the framework for us for a little bit. We're going to go through some predefined questions, some preset questions that we want to kind of help establish the conversation. And then we want to open it up for a bunch of conversation from you guys, to ask questions, to have dialogue together. The setup is weird, because we should just be on the ground. This is weird. But we're going to make it more conversational, and we'll get a chance to interact with one another and to talk. And so that's the plan. And so I want to invite Dr. Yukon Chu to come up, and he's going to just set a framework for us, and then we'll take it from there, okay?
All right.
I think you'll probably just turn you on, maybe.
Okay, this is on. Okay, sorry about that. I'm looking for the on-off switch. Hey, my name is Yukon. I am not South Asian, just in case you're wondering. No, some people have wondered if my brother is from Nagaland. I guess if I was a little darker, I might look like I'm from Nagaland, but I'm from East Asia originally. So I'm a pastor in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and have been in church planting, multi-ethnic church planting since 2003. And so I think I was, back in 2003, if some of you have been in ministry for that long, you'll remember that the multi-ethnic conversation at that time involved, we knew that white people could plant multi-ethnic churches, we knew that black people might be able to, but like Asians and Latinos, like there was a big question mark. The only person doing it at that time was probably Erwin McManus and Dave Gibbons at New Song. And so I kind of came up in that era of multi-ethnic church planting, and by God's grace, through a series of different events, God has been doing some neat things through our church movement and in planting multi-ethnic churches. So again, I'm really happy and excited to be here. This is my first advanced conference. I do need to say one more thing, which I think is really, really crazy before we jump in. The person who believed in me and assessed me as a church planter in 2003 when I was 25 was Linda Berquist, actually. And she, prior to moving to the Bay Area, was in San Diego. She was like a missions pastor for a well-known church there, Del Cerro Baptist Church. And she sat down with me. Back then, back in 2003, like, no one knew really how to plant churches for the new millennium, new century. And so people were still trying to figure out. Linda was, the guru and expert. Her church planting assessment was very simple. Sat down with me for 4 hours, and at the end, she's like, okay, you're ready to go. You're good. I was like, okay, all right, here we go. Let's do this. And so it's really cool that she's one of the keynote speakers here. We haven't seen each other in a long time, so it's good to be here. Last year at Advance, according to the documentation that I saw, this beautiful man here gave a presentation on the biblical basis of multi-ethnic churches for the Advance Initiative. Much of the talk was centered around the concept of oneness, specifically found in Ephesians 2. And I think that's a great place to start to understand why biblically we should have multi-ethnic churches. The text is very clear about it. God, through the cross, when Jesus died, he was trying to reconcile not only us to God, but in fact us to each other. The context there was speaking to Jews and Gentiles, the two people groups. And if you look at the details, it's pretty fascinating because, a lot of times we think multi-ethnic churches should happen kind of like the whole dating triangle. Do you remember the dating triangle we talk about in like ministry? Like God is on the top and the guy and the girl are here. And the closer you move to God, the closer you'll be to each other, kind of dating thing. And practically that makes sense for multi-ethnic church. But when you read Ephesians 2 closely, you'll realize that Paul's logic is not necessarily that, although practically he may mean that. Paul's logic in the text tells us that, no, God was trying to reconcile us to each other, Jew and Gentile to each other first, create a new man, and from there reconcile us to God. Yeah. And so it's very fascinating that multi-ethnic church, the concept of a multi-ethnic church, is not like a byproduct of the gospel. It's not a byproduct of the cross. It is the reason, one of the key reasons why Jesus died a bloody death on the cross for us. Now, what's fascinating, of course, is as Paul continues to discuss this in Ephesians, he continues to build on that, but in very subtle ways. In Ephesians, we get a lot of Paul's theology because it's a later book written when he was in prison. And he develops just a robust theology, right? But one of the, I think, coolest verses in the Bible about multi-ethnicity is found in Ephesians 3, actually. And it's kind of an offhand comment. And depending on our translations, we might not catch that this is a verse on the multi-ethnic church. But I think it's an important one that we often miss. And so I want to direct your attention to Ephesians 3 as we get started. And I'll just say a couple things here, and I'll go and get my seat. But Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 10. You'll remember that all throughout the opening chapters of Ephesians so far, Paul has been discussing God's powerful plan in our world, reconciling people to himself. In Ephesians chapter 2, he brings up this issue of multi-ethnicity, the oneness that was discussed last year. And then in Ephesians 3, what happens is he gets into the details, and he begins to talk about how this was the mystery, this reconciliation of both Jew and Gentile to God was a mystery. Like, people didn't know how it was supposed to work, how it was going to work, but God has now revealed through Jesus, right? And then as he's discussing that in Ephesians 3:10, notice what he says, right? He's saying how Christ, in verse 9, is bringing to light everyone what the plan of the mystery hidden for the ages in God who created all things. That mystery, if you read a few verses before, is the Jew-Gentile coming to God together. And then in verse 10, he says this, so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. God was doing all these things, bringing Jew, Gentile to himself, so that, let me read it again, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Now, the question is, okay, Yukon, this is a nice sounding verse, but where is the idea of the multi-ethnic church found in here? Well, that word manifold is a fascinating word to think about. It's only used once in our New Testament. But if you look at its secular usage, so its usage outside in everyday Greek world, it means multicolored. It's used in the cloth industry of the time, used in the art industry. And I think Paul is using this word very strategically. Not only because he's just been talking about this multi-ethnic church idea, but you remember Paul, he was a church planner in the marketplace. You remember one of his right-hand women was Lydia, who is a dealer in cloth. You knew that Paul was always in the marketplace working leather. You talk about a guy who was around multicolored fabrics, the multicolored art scenes in these great cities like Ephesus. Ephesus was the capital of the Asian Roman Empire, second only to Rome. Paul's trying to paint for us a picture, literally, quite literally, that through the church, the Jew-Gentile reconciled church, the multi-ethnic church, God would paint a multicolored vision of what his kingdom is supposed to look like. And not only is God doing this, but notice who God is doing this for. What is this for? Many times we talk about the multi-ethnic church, and we think about it, rightly so, in terms of Jesus' prayers in John 17. I pray that they would be one so that the world would know. I am 100% behind that idea, that reality, that the multi-ethnic church is one of the best witnesses to the love of God and the deity and savior status of Jesus in our world. For sure, hands down. But notice that Paul doesn't make that point here. Paul says in verse 10, right? God is doing this, showing off his multi-ethnic wisdom, multicolored wisdom. Notice who he's doing it for. To the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Did you know that the multi-ethnic church is a weapon in spiritual warfare? But I mean, this is what the text is telling us. That the multi-ethnic church doesn't just declare to lost people that Jesus is real, but it's making a proclamation to the heavenly places, the heavenly authorities, the demons right here, right around us, in our city, in our country, in our world, that Jesus is king. That Jesus is Lord. That Jesus is the one who is here to rule and reign over all darkness, to defeat all authorities, and make sure that the world will know that Jesus is the one. Did you know that your multi-ethnic church, your multi-ethnic church plant, your multi-ethnic little Bible studies trying to get started, did you know that it is a weapon in the hands of mighty King Jesus in this epic spiritual battle we're in? God have mercy on us as we engage and enter in to the multi-ethnic church conversation. Thanks so much.
I just want to say, even as we were prepping for this panel, I feel like we were doing a video conference together. We were in all different places, but as I was sitting with them, I felt like, what in the world am I sitting on this stage with them for? I feel like I had to look up words in the dictionary because I couldn't even understand what they were talking about. So I feel like there's so much that we have to learn from these guys, and I'm so grateful for the chance to be able to get a preview of that even right now. Again, we want this to be a conversation, and so we want to set it up and to be able to think through, okay, we got a slight look into the biblical framework of this conversation, and then we want to also move it into, okay, so what does this look like on the ground in our churches as well? Before we do that, if we could just introduce yourself and say what you are currently doing. I think you should have a mic as well, is that right? Do we have a mic for him? You might be right there, that one there. Okay. If you can just introduce yourself, say what you're doing, what your ministry looks like, and even why this conversation of the multi-ethnic church is so important to you. If you guys can jump into that.
Hey, everyone. My name is Justin Varghese. I think one of the several Justin Vargheses that are here this weekend. So I was saying earlier, if you're not sure of someone's name, just call them Justin. There's a good chance. So I am from Long Island in New York. And about 8 years or so ago, I co-planted what is now Lighthouse Community Church, and I served on the pastoral team there for about 8 years now. And I've got a wife and 2 kids, and we've been on Long Island together, my wife and I, for about 17, 18 years. So we're really, and I was born on Long Island as well, though I was away for a few years. Really New York, born and raised. So I really had a real passion and a heart for that area. What I can say, I'm also an attorney. I'm bivocational, so I practice law as well, so I wear a couple of hats. I would say one thing that the reason why this conversation has just become an important part of our story, my wife's story, the story of our church, is largely because Long Island, much like many places in the country, so some of you from different places might resonate with this, Long Island is an extremely diverse place, diversity of thought, diversity of ethnicity, of race. But what's interesting is that though it is extremely, extremely diverse, it is extremely segregated. So it's segregated by town, it's segregated by region, it's segregated certainly within the church. It's funny, when my wife and I were looking to buy a house before we had kids, we were looking to find a town, a school district that had all different types of races and ethnicities within it. And on Long Island, we were hard pressed to find one. And even the district we're in now is 96% white or Caucasian, and then 4% everything else, though it's starting to change. And that's par for the course on Long Island. So we were just seeing this and really starting to be impacted by some of the things that Yukon was just sharing. What does God have to say about these things? What is God's heart as it relates to how different ethnicities relate to one another? And what is this supernatural thing that we believe that he's desiring to do through that? And just started to take one step after another toward that. It's been quite a journey. I don't remotely suppose to have the answers or to know, we're on a journey ourselves. It's been a long one, it's ongoing, but I'm looking forward to this conversation as well because I believe I still have a lot to learn from you guys and from you guys. So I hope you'll engage in the conversation too and we can discuss together.
Yeah, thanks. So, check one, okay, there you go. My name is, like I said, Yukon, and I've been in church planting for about 16 years. And I started actually in California in San Diego. At that time, we were next to a university campus, UC San Diego, and our church planting journey began there. It ended up growing into a church planting network, and so we have a network that focuses on multi-ethnic urban churches next to major universities called the Ethnos Network. Sam Chaco, that spoke this morning, is a part of that network. And I've been doing that for some time, like Justin said, because as I've read scripture and encountered Jesus, it's been an essential part of that journey. I am married for over 18 years, have 2 girls, 12 and 14. And about 4 years ago, we moved to New Jersey to continue with our church planting movement.
And my name is Binu. I serve at a church called 7 Mile Road. It's in Philadelphia. I have a wife, she's here somewhere, and we have 3 kids, 9, 5, and 3. For me, why this conversation is so important is because to me, it's almost even a validation of the reality of the gospel to me. Because, when I think about other religions in the world, if I think about a Hindu and I consider what does a Hindu look like, a particular picture comes to mind. Or when I think about Muslims and what does a Muslim look like, a particular picture comes to mind. But as I think about Christianity and I think about what does that look like, what does a person who's a Christian look like, it's almost hard to nail down what that could be. And to me, it's because though Christianity is expressed through cultures, it transcends culture at the same time. And I feel like the wonderful the truth about it is that it's larger than culture, but God wonderfully expresses himself and engages us through culture. And to me, the fact that Christianity is expressed through a myriad of cultures is a reminder that the gospel is most fully seen through all cultures, not just one. And so it's just a real encouragement to me to say, I know this thing is true because it can't be nailed down by any one person or people group. It's the gospel for all people of all over the world. And so even as we're thinking through that, it's a real encouragement to me. Even for 7 Mile Road, we just celebrated 10 years. And so when we started, we would say we were probably 99.9% Indian, the church was. I think there was like a mouse who wasn't Indian at the church at that point. By God's kindness to us, 10 years later, we're 50-50. So we're 50% Indian and then 50% all different types of backgrounds. And I think, again, as we're trying to think through, hey, what does that look like? It's new territory for us as well to think through, even as Indian leaders, what does it look like for us to lead a multi-ethnic church that wants to include all different backgrounds and experiences in a meaningful way? So I'm really grateful for this conversation as well. So even as I feel like we're tossing around the word multi-ethnic a lot, and maybe we have all sorts of definitions of what that means. Guys, what do we mean by the word multi-ethnic? What is it? What is it not? What are we even talking about here?
So I think about if we take a look and use that word in Ephesians 3, this multicolored, and if we think about the tapestry of Paul's time, I like that image of tapestry and being multicolored, because what happens is, on one hand, each color of the string of the tapestry retains its own color, and then when you put it together with another color, a beautiful picture emerges. And so multi-ethnic, what we mean by multi-ethnic typically is a retention of culture and ethnicity, or we'll talk about ethnicity first, we'll talk about culture later. A retention of your ethnic expression and understanding of God and Jesus, put aside another one to form a beautiful picture. We're not talking about a melding of color. I don't know about you all, but I remember my kids when they would mix all the paint colors together and you just get this nasty, weird brown, gray thing. That's not the multi-ethnic church. That's like gray church. I don't know what it is, but it's somehow this retention of color, putting it together in a unified way, that there's a creator behind it, Jesus himself, as he builds the church, to express, again, his manifold wisdom to the world today. And so those are some key elements of it, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like it's easy for us to get the sense that multi-ethnic is trying to get people from different ethnicities under the same roof, into the same space. And there's goodness in that. There's goodness in that togetherness. But it can sometimes feel like we want to be multi-ethnic, so let's get people who are different from one another into the same space and then assimilate into this new thing that melds everyone together, like when you put paint or Play-Doh together and you get some blob of whatever, right? And like I said, it's not less than that togetherness, because that supernatural thing that Yukon was talking about earlier, that I believe that God is doing through the gospel, through multi-ethnicity, that includes our togetherness, our sharing of the same space. So it's not less than that, but it is more than that. And I'm looking forward to this conversation, to talking through a little bit of what is it? What is the more than that togetherness of people from different ethnicities? So.
You guys can jump in with the preciseness of this stat, but I think sociologically speaking, even as people sometimes define what multi-ethnic means, people sometimes use the 80-20 rule, right? They say in a church context, no more than 80% of your church can be one ethnic background. So if 80% are white and 20% are different, you're considered a multi-ethnic church. But what's interesting about that is, even with that generous rule, if 80% of your church is one ethnicity and 20% other, what's the percentage of churches in America that are multi-ethnic under that definition?
I think less than 15%, right?
Yeah, so consider that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even with that very generous rule, there's not many churches. And that's why this conversation is so important, because we're saying this is a gospel issue. So we're not just saying this is what we prefer, this is what we have an opportunity for. We're saying this is a gospel issue, and even with that gospel mandate, to consider the number of churches that actually fall into that category is really challenging. Yeah. Can we explore that a little bit more, even as you were saying, Justin, differentiating between multi-ethnic and multicultural, right? So sometimes we say, okay, if we can get a bunch of people, different colors into the same room, we're a multi-ethnic church all of a sudden, right? But what does it look like to be not just multi in our ethnicity, but even multi in our culture and how it's represented and included in a church context? What does that look like?
Well, there's an extent to which within every ethnicity is a culture. The word culture is sort of a broad term in a lot of ways, isn't it? Right? Yeah. So any people group will have a culture. There's church culture. There's culture at your work, right? What is the work culture like, right? Within a given ethnicity, there is goodness within a given culture. So many of us here are South Asian or Indian, and there is goodness that comes from our culture, right? We are a fiercely hospitable people, right? which is a beautiful and good thing, and that's a part of our culture. It's part of what causes us as a people group to thrive in a lot of different ways, right? And there's elements of culture that exist in all different ethnicities. When we talk about being multi-ethnic and multicultural, and I love what Yukon was getting at, of how a given ethnicity maintains the uniqueness and the goodness of their culture and creates space for us to be shaped by one another in our different cultures and our different ethnicities. So, like I said, I think that sometimes the tendency can be, even well-intentioned, for us to get various people from different ethnicities together and say, okay, well, how can we assimilate into either a dominant ethnicity or culture that's sort of dictating that or helping bring that together, which is, like I said, it's not with evil intent, but nonetheless, it can sometimes go toward that. And when I think of ethnic, well, at Lighthouse, we don't call it multi-ethnic, we call it ethnic inclusivity, partly because we wanted the term itself to reflect this idea that it's not so much ethnic multi, it's not just many ethnicities, but it's in fact ethnicities being included in what makes us a community of followers of Jesus. So what is it going to look like now for us to include one another in our own hearts and create space for that and allow for us to be shaped by one another so that I'm being shaped by the goodness of my African American brothers and sisters and my East Asian brothers and sisters and all of the goodness of their culture, that I'm allowing myself to be shaped by that, though that is uncomfortable because I'm most inclined to run to the mirror, to that which is most familiar, right? And how might they be willing to be shaped by the goodness of what is my ethnicity and my culture? So there's I guess it's that idea of expanding our notion of what it is beyond that togetherness, not less than that, but beyond that, and wondering, how is the gospel inviting us to be shaped by one another? How do we reflect Jesus more, I think more profoundly when we create space for that?
Yeah, we have a saying at Ethnos that we need to be multi-ethnic not just in composition, but also operation. And so there's a huge difference, and it comes down to what Justin is describing. And I think another way multi-ethnicity happens, it's happening when you have a difference of people at the table of decision-making power. I think how decisions are made is a crucial element of the multi-ethnic church, how you can gauge if you're moving in the right direction. I would add another thing to the multicultural, multi-ethnic difference. Multicultural, like Justin, you said, is a broad term, and so it forces us to think and deal with things beyond ethnicity. And right now, I know in a lot of church planting circles, as the multi-ethnic conversation moves forward, now people are dealing with issues of multi-class, multi-socioeconomic church planting, because it's one thing to get people from all different ethnic backgrounds into a space, but if they all have like master's degrees and PhDs, it's kind of like there's a lot of commonality still. And we know in our church planting movement, as we're pressing into more urban spaces that are more varied socioeconomically, when we realize, man, if we're going to use the word multicultural, then it's going to be really challenging, because now we're not just talking about getting along with rich or poor, or getting along with college-educated African Americans, like in our context, but rich and poor African Americans, and they're just totally different. So it's yet another layer of, I think, what Jesus wants, though, right? This multi-varied composition in his body.
Even, again, practically for us, again, 10 years in, we're 50-50, but we have often joked. We have said, if you blindfolded somebody and brought them to 7 Mile Road, it almost just feels like a white evangelical church. They wouldn't even know that there was many colors or that there's about 50% of them are Indian. So even for us, it's a real conversation to figure out, okay, so we have many colors in the room, but what does it look like for us to celebrate the backgrounds here, include that in the life and the the life and expression of the church as well. So even like some simple things of like, we had several race and church conversations where we have African Americans, we have Latinos, we have Asians, we have white folks at the church. So literally getting everybody around the table and say like, what is this like for you? What are some things about your own cultures that you love and celebrate? And how do we even think about including those elements into our church as a local church? Because we would say we have blinders on ourselves, even as leaders. So we know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know, And so even to be able to be instructed by them and to be taught, hey, this is something that we really value in my culture, and to think about how do we create some space to be able to include that, and so that all of us are almost equally uncomfortable because we're being exposed to brand new things that we're not used to. And so even for us, like, I think it's a wonderful point that we're realizing the conversation of multi-ethnicity is not just bringing a bunch of different colors into the room, but how do you include in a meaningful way and celebrate that in a meaningful way is something that we're trying to figure out ourselves 10 years later as well. So even with that, what are some of the challenges of even this pursuit? Again, we do it because the Bible clearly tells us to do that. Even as we try to do this thing on the ground, what are some of the challenges that people often face in trying to pursue multi-ethnicity or multiculturalism?
Even to kind of extend a little bit off of, I feel like the answer to that question extends a little bit off of something that you mentioned a moment ago when we talk about different socioeconomic groups coming together in community. And I feel like part of the reason that becomes challenging, it's been challenging at Lighthouse in a lot of ways, though we have a lot of different ethnicities in the room. We have very one type of socioeconomic class. And I realize that it's oftentimes because different socioeconomic classes don't always feel safe with one another, right? So as much as, upper income socioeconomic classes don't always feel safe with lower, it's the same way the other way around. Yeah. And I've thought about that a lot and started to think about how our desire for safety and our desire for protection, well, there's actually goodness in there. Our desire to protect ourselves, protect what we believe is good, right? We pursue and walk toward our own ethnicity and our own culture and our own tendencies because we believe that they are good. And there's goodness in that protection. I think that's part of the ways that we're made in the image of God, because God is one of protection, right? But what has been a process for me in thinking about how that has become such an obstacle towards walking towards this good thing that God is doing in a multi-ethnic environment is starting to beginning personally and for us as a community to repent of our attempts to protect ourselves. That it is not my job to protect that which I consider good, though there is goodness there. That I can lean on and claim the promises of God as our protector, and therefore I can open my hand. And that is kind of like a first step. It was for me, and then helping our community walk through that, and we're still on this journey. Yeah. But helping our community become a community of repentance that says we don't need to protect ourselves. That in fact God is the one that's protecting us. So I don't need to protect my space of what I believe is the best way, the right way, a good way of doing things and creating space for others. To me, that whole idea of safety and protection has been something that has been helpful to both consider the goodness of, but also repent of the ways in which we try to claim it on our own and claim God's promises with respect to that instead. And I feel like that initial step for me was really groundbreaking because it was like, you know what, I could let go and say, yeah, though I have this sense of what is best here, that I don't need to protect that. Yeah. That if I would open my hand and let God be the one that protects, it's amazing what he would teach you through people who are different than you. So.
And I think it's really challenging, Justin, because in a lot of evangelical circles, we are taught to protect the faith, right? Apologetics, the defense of the faith. But when we start addressing what you're talking about, I mean, we have to let go and trust God in areas that we've been trained to protect, like something like theology, right? And I'm not trying to mess around with the gospel at all, but I think about, for example, I grew up, I don't know if you all grew up with this, but I grew up oftentimes with pastors from my ethnic background critiquing repetitive worship music, right? Oh, it's so shallow, it's repetitive, and the backgrounds I came from, the hymns with a lot of verses and deep theology, quote unquote, was like the better way than the repetitive CCM stuff or whatever was out there. I was in on a conversation where a white brother was critiquing African American music, gospel music, for being repetitive as well. And we all had to pause because we realized that is such a shallow critique of black gospel music that's repetitive, because that is perhaps some of the greatest theological worship music out there, because it's born out of this history of suffering and slavery, and it's theologically rich. Even though they're saying the same thing 20 times, it is deep theology if you understand gospel music properly. Yeah, it doesn't have 20 verses like your Western hymn. And so again, we're trained in these ways to critique, protect what's good theology, what's good practice, whatever. And again, then politics get involved too, right? Again, evangelical culture, we can marry the two. And so, in our congregation, we have, I think 20% of our congregation is undocumented Latinos, right? And yeah, most evangelicals grew up on a Republican bent, and right now, especially in this climate, the idea of being undocumented here illegally, you didn't stand in line in the right line and just wait your turn, all these things. Again, we can come in thinking we're protecting a notion of what is moral, what is theologically better, what is whatever, and miss out on what Jesus is actually trying to do in building his church. And it's hard, because you have to lay at the altar your theological pride, your political pride, your social pride, everything. Yeah.
One more question before we open it up to everybody, but even for some of us in the room, grew up Indian American in churches where people kind of looked like us, spoke the same languages as we did. And so for us in those experiences, as you guys consider, as those who are really committed to multi-ethnicity and really, what's the room for ethnic-specific churches? Is there a room for ethnic-specific churches? And what does that look like? How do we consider churches that maybe have congregated together people who are all like that way? How do we think about that?
Yeah. So I think ethnic-specific churches are really a beautiful thing as part of the development of the church here in North America. Many of myself, so I came to Jesus in a East Asian, a Chinese American church. And when I look at the history of the Chinese American church and of many South Asian churches here in North America, they were started not just because of language, but because also of exclusion, right? Exclusion from the mainstream church at that time. And I think churches played and continue to play a crucial role in providing safety, the safety to worship, the safety to understand the gospel in our own mother tongue, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think as I look at the gospel, as I look at the story of Jesus, I know Jesus is calling us towards more. And so even though I came to know Jesus in a Chinese American church, I just felt like God calling me out of that to experience more of the kingdom. So I think there's a role to play, but as our society continues to change and as the church continues to change, as we continue to have more multi-ethnic churches, perhaps the ethnic church should see itself more as a ethnic fellowship under the larger banner of a multi-ethnic church. That's kind of how we've positioned our work at Ethnos. So for example, in one of our California churches, we had a lot of Iranians who spoke Farsi starting to come to know Jesus. And on one hand, it's interesting because they didn't feel comfortable going to the Farsi-speaking church because it struggled with a lot of what we just talked about with mono-ethnic, monocultural churches. you can get into some political ideology that's like, it's a little too ethnic and not Jesus enough. They liked the multi-ethnic church because they got a vision of Jesus that was much bigger, and yet they struggled with English. They struggled with, we struggled discipling them because we couldn't speak Farsi or we needed to use interpreters. So we came up with a system of having ethnic-specific fellowships or small groups under the banner of the multi-ethnic church to try to understand to try to essentially wrestle with the scriptures and see how this might work.
No, I agree with that so much. I really affirm the goodness and the beauty in a lot of ways of monoethnic churches. But it also occurs to me that the need for a monoethnic church and this thing that we're talking about, you use the word inclusion, this thing that we're talking about how the gospel and our different ethnicities relate to one another, those things are all related in so much as the need for the monoethnic church. I look at my parents, for instance, right? They came to this country in the early 70s, and them and a group of people formed what were Indian churches at that time in New York. I do know that before they did that, before they realized that they were all there and they could start this thing, they didn't do that the first week they got here. They went to American churches, and they immediately felt like, we don't belong here. And as I dream about what Peter and Paul and others in the scriptures are talking about in informing this good desire, this supernatural thing that God does through his church, when we walk towards this multi-ethnicity, that very ethnic inclusivity is the thing that would allow for anyone who walks in the door not to just feel like they're welcome there, but that they belong there. And I feel like if my parents had walked into a gathering of different kinds of people where they felt like they belonged there, they may not have needed to form a monoethnic church. That being said, there is goodness in our monoethnic gatherings. There is goodness in our freedom and ability to sing those songs in the same language by people who understand them and celebrate them together and enjoy that cultural bond together. There's goodness in that. But I feel like in some ways, the need for it to function as a church exists out of our need as the church to grow in some of these things. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. And I think sometimes it's helpful even to make a distinction between ethnic-specific churches and ethnocentric churches. And I think the distinction is almost in the motivation of those churches. I want to say ethnic-specific churches have a gospel desire to reach a particular group of people in a way that contextualizes the gospel to reach those people. Ethnocentric churches are churches that are not necessarily proclaiming the gospel, but preserving culture. You're almost gathering together in a church to preserve and maintain a cultural identity more than a gospel proclamation. And I think that distinction is probably helpful because at 7 Mile Road, where we're at, in the evening, there's a Portuguese-speaking church that meets together every Sunday at 6 p.m. I love it. There is a large Portuguese-speaking population in Northeast Philadelphia, and they're able to reach those people with the gospel. And the motivation of Christ the King Church that meets there at 6 p.m. Is to reach Portuguese-speaking people who don't understand English. And if they came to 7 Mile Road, it wouldn't make any sense. They don't speak the language. And so the gospel is motivating them to reach a people with the language that they can understand. But when it becomes primarily rooted in the preservation of culture, I think that's when it changes from ethnic-specific to ethnocentric. And that's probably a good distinction for us to consider. We have about 25 minutes or so to have questions. We will, again, whether it is a question that you have or even an opportunity to share even your own experiences, that would be wonderful, just for us to be able to learn from each other. To consider, we have, 30-something people in this room. So be considerate of time, just so that you guys can keep your comments or questions short. But any questions or comments that you guys have, anything that you think would help even continue this conversation, anything that you guys want to ask or throw in, yeah.
Well, this is more of a question piggybacking on what you
What's your name, brother, and where are you from? That's okay.
Hey guys, I'm Sam. I'm from San Francisco.
Okay. Yeah.
Just the comment you made in terms of whether, say, non-white
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that was the norm at that time because in the early 2000s, just the evangelical world was used to having white or black leaders like up front. And if you look at the immigration patterns, right, in the U.S., many of our parents came in the 70s because of the change in the immigration law at that time. And so, us second-gen people, our third culture people, were all still coming of age, and we were just coming of age. And so we began to finally, by God's grace, I think, assert the spiritual gifts and leadership that we had at that time period. And so I think history in the last 15 years has said, yeah, look at us. I mean, we're leading multi-ethnic churches. So God is doing it. I think the challenge has been trying to pave a quote-unquote new path forward because, I really didn't have any other Asian Americans who were doing, I didn't know of really Asian Americans who were leading multi-ethnic churches at the time. I just didn't. So there's a lot of just discovery I had to embark on. And then I had to have a strong sense of personal self-identity in trying to figure this out. I had to be comfortable being the first, quote unquote, first Asian American in certain spaces, the token Asian American in certain spaces. It's funny, New Brunswick, where I live now, the Asian American population is very small. And so I get invited into these spaces where I'm literally the only Asian American among 300 people or something, right? And it's black and white. New Brunswick is historically black and white. And I've had to grow into just being really comfortable there, being comfortable with stereotyping directed at me, racism directed at me, but just being secure in Christ and paving a new sort of way. Yeah. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Dave, and I'm here from Dallas. I attend a church that's been around in Dallas for 60 years, the Virgin Bible Church, and it's located in probably the most diverse zip code in the U.S. And so the church started at Dallas Theological Seminary, very much a white evangelical church that has a real heart to reach the diverse zip code. And so they're on this journey themselves, asking leaders like us to step in to help them on this journey to be more open and inclusive to that. So what does that practically look like in your environment? Right? And flipping it around to what would it look like in a white church environment? What should they be considerate of to create that space?
Yeah. I would say,
Question.
yeah, right. If y'all figure that out, then
Write the book.
write the book. No, I will say a couple of things come to mind, and I'm sure Yukon will have some other things as well. Yukon, you actually touched on it earlier when he was talking about what it looks like to include leaders from different ethnicities, and again, not just having. It's the same concept where it's not just leaders from different ethnicities sharing the same space but being pulled into assimilation, but instead creating space and elevating the good and meaningful voices of people who are different from one another and leaning in towards that, though it's uncomfortable, right? And I have found that, so I, as a leader at Lighthouse, and as we've sought to do that, I've personally experienced the discomfort of that, where we will have leaders of other ethnicities come and share an idea, a way of doing things, because what that leadership diversity helps accomplish is diversity of our form. And what I believe that has helped accomplish is that idea of where people are coming in the doors or coming into our community in one form or another and feeling like they belong, because our heart for multi-ethnicity expanded into our leadership, and from there it influenced our form. So being willing to not just hear and think about how I want to possibly incorporate an ideology that's different than mine, but in fact leaning into it to the point that's saying that is good. Like, I want to be shaped by that personally, and we as a community need to be shaped by that. Now, that is a very hard thing because, like I said, our tendency is to protect, and we find safety in that with which we're most familiar and most comfortable. So I would say that one thing is that leadership. The other thing that comes to mind, like I said, which is sort of that next step from a diverse leadership team, is the effect that it has on the form, on how the church functions. So, for instance, at Lighthouse, we began, as our leadership team became more diverse, we began to function in a way that reflected the goodness of our different ethnicities. So in some ways, that was things like the way that we worshiped. We would sing in different languages, and those are all good things. We would eat one another's foods. Those are all good things. I really do affirm that. But after doing that for a bunch of years, I started to realize that even that is good, but if we're just doing those expressions as an end in and of themselves, we're still missing out on the goodness of being shaped by one another, right? So we would sing songs in Spanish or even Malayalam, but it would sound like a CCM song with Spanish lyrics, Not that there's anything wrong with that in and of itself, but what I've done is I've said, okay, let me window dress a little bit, and not with a bad intention, but it's just where it landed. And then as time went on, we said, you know what? Let's let our recently immigrated Latinos in our community lead us in those songs so we can sing it and play it the way that they do, and be shaped by the goodness of that. And so honestly, it is a journey. But I think it starts with a willingness to create space for that in our hearts, and then space for that in our form, and to lean in towards that. So.
And I would add one more thing, just on the other side of it. I think what has been wonderful, even at 7 Mile Road, where currently we have 3 elders who are Indian who are pastors. Even for white Americans to come and submit to the leadership of ethnic people like that has been wonderful for us. Not with any qualification, not with like, hey, we're just doing you a favor. It has done a work to help shape even just our ability to even consider, as I don't remember who said it, but like, we're trying to figure ourselves out in this whole process. Who are we? Are we able to lead this sort of thing as Indians? Like, we've been sort of on the periphery for forever. And so are we able to lead a context where brown people are now leading many different colors? And I think even for various ethnic folks, Christians who love the gospel, love Jesus, love people, to come and submit under leaders who are not like them, I think is a wonderful thing that people can be doing to help create cultures of multi-ethnicity as well.
I would add one more thing. One is the person who's done the most research on that question, you probably have read his books or seen it, is Mark Demas, Mosaics, Multiethnic Church kind of movement. Their triennial conference is coming here in Dallas in a couple weeks, so the Mosaics, Multiethnic Church conference, really important, especially if you're trying to help a mono-ethnic, monocultural church transition. He literally has he does have if not multiple books on that, so he has the book. But I think an honest part of the conversation has to be this reality that any majority cultured church that wants to make the transition has to recognize the power they have and how the power has been misunderstood or misused. And so in the case of a white church, I know this is tough to talk about, but things like white privilege and the history, especially in the South, the history of racism in the South have to be addressed very plainly and directly in order for there to be genuine reconciliation and a movement towards a multi-ethnic church as God would intend. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. You want to go first? Yeah. Sure.
My name is Anna. I'm from the Dallas area. I actually I serve in a multicultural church and multi-ethnic church. What I have noticed is that even in that context, there are still silos everywhere. Black, white, blue. So do y'all ever encourage in your multi-ethnic churches those silos? I know you mentioned fellowships. So how far do you let that go? Because if we understand
Good question. We at Ethnos, we don't let it go too far. We do in some ways, but we don't in other ways. We have this belief that in order to claim that something is part of the DNA of the church, that it has to be talked about in every space, in every moment, as much as possible, right? So if our church really believed in evangelism, let's say, at every key gathering spot, we'd talk about evangelism. We'd have stories on evangelism. We'd press for action based on evangelism. We'd pray for evangelism. It just have to be in every space in order for that to truly be a value. And I think the same in our context with multi-ethnicity. It just has to be in every space a front issue that's understood. Again, in light of the gospel. This is about the gospel when all is said and done. So there's that half. On the other hand, of course, I mean, we naturally feel like certain things are just easier to talk about among our own, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but we don't let that go very far because it's a quick slope downwards into some behavior that we've come to say I don't know if we want that kind of behavior here. So
Yeah. So I agree with that. I would say we have lots of people from various ethnic groups that congregate together. It's normal, including the Indians. I would say that from a DNA perspective, we spend a lot of energy talking about the difference between friendship and fellowship, which are both good things. But as we're trying to help people toward enjoying the goodness of friendship that often comes from an aggregation of people, right? People who are the same, and moving towards being a congregation of people, it's helping people walk toward our just wholehearted belief that God is doing something supernaturally good through that fellowship, that congregation, so that we can enjoy the goodness of this aggregation of people, of our friendships, oftentimes within our whatever group of people we feel most safe in. So sometimes that's ethnic, sometimes that's socioeconomic, sometimes it could be whatever it is that makes us uniform where we feel the most safe. And there's goodness in enjoying that, but helping people also walk toward the supernatural goodness of our connecting in the way we've been talking about today, across ethnic lines, across socioeconomic lines, across racial lines. So,
I would just say, just even to affirm the difficulty of what you're saying, at least on the ground, we would say one example is, we have these smaller communities. Our smaller communities are geographically assigned, and so there's all different types of people in the groups together. And I would lead these groups, and I would have Malayalis who joke with each other in Malayalam, and there's non-Malayalis who are in the group, and I would get so angry. I'd be like, oh my gosh. So after we get home, I email them. I'm like, listen, guys, you got to remember, there's non-Malayalis in the room. You can't do that. You can't do that. So you kindly, gently rebuke them, right? But at the same time, when one of these race and church conversations that we had, one of the things that we said was hey, from the front, from on a Sunday morning, we're not going to make any Indian even though at that point there was 90% Indians, and even sermon illustrations, there were things that would just land because everybody gets it. We said we would never make an illustration that was Indian, we would never serve Indian food, etc. We never did it. And then we had this race and church conversation. At that point, we were probably 60-40. And one of the non-Indian people said hey, why don't you guys ever serve Indian food? That's your culture, but we never get a chance to participate in it, and it's true. We never did it. And so literally 9 years in, for the first time during a members meeting, we had Indian food. And people were we loved that. And so I think for us, to affirm your question, it's such a hard thing to figure out. When is it okay for us to be ourselves? And when is it not okay for us to, and when does you being you leave someone out? And when does you being you invite someone in? And all that to say, I have no clue. And we're still trying to figure it out, But it's such a hard thing to balance and to try to figure out on the date. And so I think you're making a ton of mistakes. But at the end of the day, I feel as Jesus says, in the scriptures it say, if we consider somebody else as greater than ourselves, I think that drives it. So if I can love my brother, my sister, who is not like me, that not only allows me to love them, but allows me to be myself at the same time. Because my motivation is not to move myself on them, but to say, I love you and I love everything about you. And in loving you, I want to share my own story with you as well. And how that works out is a hard thing that we don't know. So when you figure it out, let us know, please.
You guys can write that book together.
Yeah, there's a
I will
combination.
read it.
Many
I
books
will
to be
read it.
written in this conversation. Go ahead, brother. You had a question as well, right? You're asking between first and second generation? I would, again, so at least the 50% of our church that's Indian is almost, I would say 90% of those people are Malayali, right? And so, so I can speak to that context at least. And I think even in doing this sort of work, there is just a skepticism sometimes that's created because it is a different work. It's a, I know you said don't call it pioneering work or like groundbreaking work, but it's a new thing that we don't have language for or like reference to, right? And so like when people see it, they don't know what to make of it. And so like we joke sometimes like the one thing that we have done is like bring different groups of people together because they all think we're a cult, right? So they all feel like this is a horrible thing that's happening. We all hate it. And so we especially with first and second generation, we want partnership, but I don't know that it's easy to have that type of partnership because it's so new that they don't know how to make sense of it. And it's so different than what they're used to that they don't know how to describe it or to say whether it's okay or not. And so genuinely, I'm not just saying this because we're up here, we genuinely pray for that regularly, that there would be greater gospel partnership between first and second generation, that we would not feel divided.
Amen.
But again, what that looks like and how that's lived out is complicated because there's so much unknown that it develops this skepticism and barrier between generations.
Yeah, I think what you put your finger on is then how we differentiate between multi-ethnic and multicultural, right? Because you're talking about a cultural difference, first gen, second gen culture. And so this is where the conversation gets more robust. I think I totally agree with what you're pressing into. I think one thing to remember too, and again, does Jesus work beyond this? Yes, definitely. But I've been really helped by the social science observation about the bell curve of adaptation. Maybe you've seen this in like discussed in areas of technology, that the early adapters for any new thing, let's say when the iPhone first came out, the early adapters, true innovators, number one, are like 2% of our population. Early adapters are, I think, 15%. Most of us are mid adapters, like the next 40%, and then you have the late adapters in the bell curve. And I think with what I've observed, at least with monocultural, monoethnic churches, immigrant churches specifically, that started in the 70s, that I think that kind of holds true. You have innovators, maybe people like us who just kind of broke out for different reasons, and then you have the early adapters that you can really have robust conversations with, and they'll maybe join the churches. And then you have this big chunk of mid-adapters. And I think one of the challenges for the next 15 years, honestly, for people like us who are third culture, who live in between two cultures, is how do we disciple that large percentage of mid-adapters? How do we work with those first-generation pastors to disciple them so that we can become God's beautiful multicultural church together? I think it's definitely uncharted territory that we got to figure out.
Yeah, I think that when I think about that generational difference, to me, there's an extent to which this same idea of walking towards safety is the thing that allows for real connection. So I have found that, surprisingly, actually, to me, so our church has had great difficulty in growing in a diversity of generations. So of getting age diversity within our community. To the extent that we have, or even as I look into the Indian circles that I'm in, surprisingly, I have actually seen more of a willingness from a first generation to take a step toward the second generation than the other way around. And the reason why I think that is because the first generation is walking towards the second generation just slightly. They're uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar. The second generation is oftentimes less likely to walk towards the first generation because it is riddled with hurt. And that changes the game, right? There's a lot of hurt there that needs to be processed. So the reason I say that is because whether you're walking towards something unfamiliar or being asked to walk towards something that at some point in your life caused you some hurt, either way, there is a need for safety. The reason we don't do it is we're protecting ourselves. So when I think about discipling people well in this, it's helping them understand and see that we can claim God's protection, God's promises in that respect, and not feel the need to protect ourselves. That being said, in a situation where there's hurt, there's of course process that needs to happen to get from here to there. You can't go around it, you can only go through it. But these are some of the things I think that inform the difficulty there.
That's so helpful.
That's a good word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mike Rose, and I have a question. And this is kind of spurred on by what something Justin said. And so, Justin, you mentioned that the hope is that as you create space for different voices in leadership in a church, then you see multicultural, those who are become a greater platform. And so I'm curious, like, for me as a white male evangelical, I know that I have power, and I can try to help those who don't have the power to get the power, or be a good steward of it and give it away. But like, I think there's an element of shame when you walk into maybe a great or a more multi-ethnic expression of the gospel, for I guess for who you are. Maybe like for white people, like ashamed of our heritage and what we've done to people of color in this country. But then like maybe for those who are brown, like this sense of like I have to hide my brownness because I won't be fully accepted for who I am in this space, and it's not a safe space because it's not fully, I guess, like where I came from, in my brownness. So like I guess what I'm asking is in the context of discipleship, how do you help your people like embrace who they are, made in the image of God, and really and help them understand that they do have a voice to give in all that they are, and so that there is multiculturalism that's happening as opposed to just a monocultural expression. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that question. Thank you so much for asking that, because I feel so strongly that it is two sides of a really important coin that need to be together. When we talk about creating space to be shaped by others, the other incredibly important side of that coin is that others can and should be shaped by the goodness of who God created you. There's something uniquely good about that, about your ethnic background. But like I said, this expands beyond just ethnicities, right? This expands to everything that makes you uniquely good and God's creation, because you will be you for all of eternity, and that includes your ethnicity. And when we think about that, and we think not only do we want, I think that sense of shame comes about when an environment is only creating space to be shaped by others and not equally valuing the fact that God is desiring that others would be shaped by us. So that, in fact, affirms all of the goodness and uniqueness and value of what makes you black, white, Indian, Caucasian, whatever it is, right? So, and all of the other things that make us different from one another. So to me, I've felt really passionate about helping people appreciate that. I have seen, so in our environment where we've worked so hard to try to create ethnically inclusive space, it's my white brothers and sisters who have been sometimes too ashamed to say it out loud, but they'd come to me privately with a sense of, what about me? And that's heartbreaking to me, because what I want for them to feel is that their voice And all the goodness of what they bring to our community is just as important as what this newly immigrated person from wherever brings. So it's got to be it's got to be highly valuing both, if that makes sense.
I think in our context, so in our membership process, we have 4 books on multi-ethnic churches that members can choose to read from. 2 of them have to deal with how to enter into the space as a white person. One's called Being White, the other is called White Awake, and those are some good resources for that conversation. But going to the root of what you're talking about, this issue of like coming to grips with our identity and letting the transformation process happen through that. Yeah, I think we just have to really think about our discipleship curriculum and the lenses to which we approach our discipleship. Are we really helping people root well in Christ, in Jesus, and letting that inform everything about who they are? It's challenging, but it has to get there.
Guys, even when we started planning for this, we realized the scope of this conversation is so big, and so we know we can't cover a lot. And so hopefully this conversation can continue even as you're eating lunch with one another. But again, we really do mean it. We would love to hear even your own experiences and your own stories. So please be sure that we can interact and to be able to talk with each other. Hopefully this was just a good primer, a good initiator of conversation, and just a way for us to think about things, maybe even things that we thought about, but maybe put words to it as well.